If you time traveled back to a medieval town, what would you see? What would you hear? What would you smell? Would you immediately say, "Holy shit, I want to go home," and run for your time machine? Or would you stay, at least for a bit, and take in the ambience, the smells, the sights, the crime, and the disease? These and other questions will be answered right after this. I'm Professor Jerome Arkenberg, and I've been teaching a wide variety of history courses at colleges across this country for the past 30 years. In this video, I'm going to tell you about the kind of medieval towns, their layouts, and their street plans. The look, feel, and, yes, smell of medieval towns, how medieval towns were governed, religion and the medieval town, and medieval urban housing. At the end, I'll have the wrap-up quote on this video. But first, make sure to click like, share, and subscribe, and that little bell thingy, so I can continue to bring you more great videos just like this one. At the end of the Roman Empire in the West, cities and towns were in decline as their buildings crumbled, their water systems silted up, and the center of political and cultural life passed to the countryside, except in Italy, the south of France, and Iberia, where urban political and cultural life continued to thrive. Here life continued with fine markets, expansive mosque churches, urban gardens, extensive sewage systems, running water provided by aqueducts, gardens and orchards, great mansions and apartment houses, baths, and, in Muslim cities, hospitals, mental asylums, and pharmacies, funded by both rulers and the wealthy, so that the poor might have free health care. In Northern and Western Europe, however, many former Roman towns never regained their importance, such as St. Albans, which had been a large Roman town in England, and for much of the medieval period was simply a small medieval town. Even in regions once part of the Roman Empire, new towns grew up around castles or monasteries, or were settled as part of a colonial venture by some landlord. Here, of course, we have Bologna, which is an old Roman, actually an old Celtic town before the Romans took it over, Bologna. Lubeck, founded in the Middle Ages by a local lord. As stability returned in the High Middle Ages, trade revived, and so did town life. Paris, Genoa, Venice, Florence, and London grew to well over 35,000 people. But most towns were small, around 1,000 to 3,000 people. You could fit all of them into a modern American baseball stadium. One town which wouldn't even make up, let's say, the left field bleachers. One result of growing population and wealth was a great wave of building. Houses, guildhalls, cathedrals, castles, and parish churches. Medieval cities were invariably walled, though few could withstand an actual siege, but they gave protection from bandits and brigands that made country life miserable and dangerous. But walls also constricted urban growth, leading to high population density, congestion, pollution, narrow lanes, and three-story plus houses. Rivers on which most towns lay were heavily polluted. Cesspits drained into them, and tanners, dyers, fullers, butchers, and smiths dumped their waste directly into them. Town streets were covered with human and animal waste and entrails, rotting food, and swarms of rats. In 13th century London, Sherborne Lane was so deep in garbage that it was colloquially known as Shit Lane. And after the Black Death, towns hired muckrakers to rake the streets of the muck as best they could, making some sort of connection between rats, plague, and the dirt in the streets. The rotting sewage, the refuse of tanneries, slaughterhouses and dyers, the badly polluted streams and rivers, and the tons of excrement produced each day meant that most towns simply reeked. In fact, you can smell when you were coming to a large town, even worse, a large city, by how far away you could smell it. No town could grow by natural increase, as town life was so unbelievably deadly from pollution, sickness, and crime that a constant stream of peasants emigrating from the countryside was necessary just to keep the population stable. You see here, besides the many people being buried, these are mapped out in medieval London. These are the murder hotspots. The main areas of town, not near St. Paul's Cathedral, where many of the taverns existed. Funny how that works. In layout, some towns were but large villages, replete with curving streets, as if the streets were laid out by a wandering drunken cow, along with narrow lanes, courtyards, markets, gardens, orchards, even cemeteries. But many, if not most, towns were planned in some way, often around a castle, a cathedral, a monastery, or a palace. Towns might be founded by lords to bring in trade and taxes, platting streets on a rectangular grid. But towns might start with one plan, and subsequent additions change to other ones. Castle towns grew up below the castle to service the castle's builders and garrison, while the castle protected the town and its market. The town's walls might even be linked with the castle's defenses. Here, of course, is medieval Krakow, starting with the original Wawel, the castle. This is the old town, and then this is the later rectangularly platted new town. Monastic towns were founded for similar purposes, and were broadly similar in plan, with the main street sweeping away from the Abbey Gate, leading down to the town market. And here we see, of course, Mont Saint-Michel, the famed monastery on the island off the coast of Normandy. Of course, a town grew up below it to service those who had to work in the town, who had to work at the monastery, including the builders. This, of course, is Canterbury and Rebay in Germany. There were also college towns from the 13th century, such as Oxford and Cambridge, where advanced teaching was provided, becoming the main reason for the town's existence, which grew to service the students and scholars. Every town was divided into parishes, with their own church to serve the people's needs. And here you see these are the various churches in the city of London itself, all rebuilt. I mean, they're everywhere, though who would actually attend them is a problem. And these are the parishes in Norwich. This is the cathedral precinct. Then these are all the different little parishes. So here we are again. There was no set number of people per parish. For example, Norwich here have 50 parishes for 5,000 people. Yet Coventry, with a population of 2,000 people, had but 3. These churches were hubs of community life, where people came to socialize, relax, and celebrate religious holidays. The difference here is the top picture is what the old St. Paul's Cathedral in London would have looked like before, of course, the cathedral and the heart of London burned down in 1666. The bottom is an illustration of what medieval Paris would have looked like, this being Notre Dame de Cathedral, which nearly burned down in 2018. The larger towns might also have at least one monastery and convent, and after the 12th century, a friary, and those where the bishop had his palace, his court, and a cathedral church designed to hold the town's entire population. Legally, towns were set up in 2 ways in the Middle Ages. First off, a feudal town, which was run like a manor, with stewards and bailiffs who reported to a feudal lord. This, of course, the steward and bailiffs, and this is a bit different. This, of course, would be the mayor and his bailiffs. The steward and bailiffs apparently playing dice at the lord's expense, certainly the people's expense. The second version is a charter town. Charter towns were autonomous and self-governing in exchange for payment of an annual farm, yes, F-A-R-M, farm, to its feudal lord, or the king, and was run by a mayor, seen here, his bailiffs, or bailiff, a council of aldermen, and a town chamberlain or recorder. While all of these town officers were administrators, in either type of town, they also served as judges in town courts, having their own jurisdiction and rules. Many of them also were testers. Besides testing the beer or the wine, ooh, it's a tough job, isn't it? They might also have to test the bread and other products to make sure quality standards set by the town were being upheld. Town administrators also ran weekly and special markets and fairs, maintained roads, bridges, walls, gates, water supplies, sewers, and ports, if any, and a town watch. While in charter towns, the mayor and his bailiffs also had to raise the annual farm and deal with royal or feudal officials. Here we are collecting taxes for the farm, and this taxpayer does not look terribly happy. Also, in charter towns, officials were chosen by the town's citizens. The freemen of the town, who would have been the chief bankers, merchants, and guild members, and especially the guild masters, which caused problems and occasional violence by those left out. They could live there, but they were not citizens. That is, they did not have a right to vote or to participate in town government. These would have been journeymen, apprentices, and of course, common laborers. And we're not even talking about the women. As a result, most town halls were usually located in one of the guild halls, such as the London Guildhall, or in Hildesheim, the Guildhall. These are the halls of the livery companies of London, or guilds, as you might call it. Anyway, the town halls, as I said, were usually located in one of the guild halls, and the mayor and town council were almost always guild masters. Towns had a variety of public buildings on the main market square. Perhaps a leper house outside the walls, industry away from the city center, often on streams or rivers, as they often required water, and usually a harbor or a boat launch. Here, of course, we can see medieval Dublin, industrial London, and the best part here, industrial Norwich. This is the main river through town, the River Wensum, not Winsome, or the River Lusum, but the River Wensum, and the different streams. These are the city walls. Here is Cathedral Precinct, Norwich Cathedral. This is Norwich Castle and the main market areas. An interesting note where all the various trades are located. Tanners, which of course require water. More tanners here. Smiths, masons, iron quarrying and smelting. Tanners, dyers, and dyers. This would have been a really smelly part of town where the poor tended to live. More tanners and dyers. Talliers. Remember, these are the ones who deal with pigskin and goatskin. Tenter grounds. Here we have chalk and flint quarrying and pottery kennels. Metal workers. Cooks along the river. Dyers, fullers, butchers, more tawyers, butchers, lime kennel quarrying, and in the center of town, leather workers and regular workers and some metal workers here as well. Since street space was at a premium, most houses were narrow, so that many, like this house, this is an actual medieval house that survived in London. This is a house this wide, this little part right here. Most houses were narrow so that many could sit contiguously on the street front, with narrow gangways giving access to yards back at the houses, which of course tended to make these streets quite dark, even at high noon. Anyway, but long, extending far back from the street. Though, as I said, this drastically cut down on available light, often leaving interiors dark and dank. So, for example, you'd have a row of houses like this, one after another. So, in this case, the shop would be out in front, and the living space would probably be on the second floor, maybe a third if there is one. But in the back is often where, if needed, more of the industrial work could be done. Here is what the hall would have looked like. Mostly, even in wealthier areas, there are no chairs as we would think of them today, but benches. And then the tables were simply boards laid on trestles. This is the bedchamber of a fairly wealthy guildsman. Notice the bare ceilings, if you want to call them ceilings, and the bare walls, but at least he has a decent bed. This, of course, is from London around 1870. This is what really medieval areas would have looked like before. These were all about torn down in the 1870s and 80s, and those that survived were destroyed in the London Blitz of World War II. Palaces and mansions, though, rarely conform to these narrow limits. We're often on double lots, parallel to the street. Their halls lit by large windows, as we see here. So, a very larger, and notice this part, all the chambers, the parlor, the service, the hall. And this is more what it would have looked like. Dining taking probably almost entirely during daylight hours. The rich and powerful lived near the city center, with opulent homes jetted out over the street, as seen here. fronting the main square or market because that is where all the action was. There, they were a best place to participate in the city's business. We see that here especially in this map of the wealth distribution in 14th century Amiens in France. The dark lines is where the wealthier people lived. So it's in the city center, and as you go further and further away, that is where the poorer people lived. So there was a steep drop-off in wealth the further one went from the center, from the houses of the rich to artisans and shopkeepers, then workers and laborers, and finally paupers, beggars, and fugitive peasants. And of course, this is what it would have looked like. These are some of the houses which, as I said, were torn down in London beginning in the 1870s. They were just too decrepit. Some cities, such as Rome, seen here, also had their own ghettos, where Jews voluntarily lived apart from their Christian neighbors to preserve their own ways of life and worship without being constantly harassed and persecuted. And harassed and persecuted they certainly were in the Middle Ages. Urban fires were frequent, caused by the ever-burning hearth or oven. And in fact, often you could see, if you're coming to a town, even beyond the limit, the smell area, you can see because there is a constant pall of black smoke on the horizon over the city, because the fires of industrial concerns or of houses were burning nearly all the time. And of course, as chimneys appeared in the 13th century, and fun fact, the first chimneys in Europe, first chimneys in the world, where apparently the chimneys were invented in Europe, the first chimneys were made out of wood. Yes. And then, afterwards, they began to make chimneys which looked more like this one, for example. So, brick or maybe plaster with wooden joists, still not a very good idea. Till eventually brick or stone. Dope. Anyway, as houses grew taller in confined urban spaces, chimneys grew longer and more tortuous, allowing soot to accumulate and eventually ignite. If you wonder what they had before chimneys, this is what they had: Greco-Roman, early medieval, and really around the rest of the world. Simply a smoke bay, or often a hearth in the middle, and there is simply a hole in the roof. And you wonder why some of these houses were drafty and cold in the winter. Of course, when it rained or snowed, God help you. It would have been wise to have some type of louver that would raise and lower when it was needed, but that was not thought of. And then you have, of course, the early smoke hood, which is like this. First, as I said, it was made out of wood, a dumb idea. Eventually, an external chimney of brick or stone, and then sometimes the internal chimney. The wrap-up quote from Giovanni d'Ambrogio, ambassador from Venice to the court of King Henry VII of England in 1496, reported back to his superiors, quote, "Although this city," meaning London, "has no buildings in the Italian style, but of timber or brick like the French, the Londoners live comfortably, and it appears to me that there are not fewer inhabitants than at Florence or Rome. It abounds with every article of luxury, as well as with the necessaries of life. In one single street named the Strand, leading to St. Paul's, there are 52 goldsmiths' shops, so rich and full of silver and gold vessels, great and small, that in all the shops in Milan, Rome, Venice, and Florence put together, I do not think there would be found so many of the magnificence that are to be seen in London." Let me know what you think of this quote in the comment section below. Also, what you liked about this video and what other historical topics or subjects you'd like to see in future videos. Be sure to click like, share, and subscribe, as it will help me bring you more great videos. And click on that little bell thingy so you'll know when the next History Waits for No One video is posted. If you want to know more, there are recommended studies from me on this topic in the description below, along with other ways to connect with me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the past.